Adab, greetings and welcome, or welcome again to Habib University's fourth Post-Colonial Higher Education Conference. I'm Nauman Naqvi, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Humanities at Habib University. This is the third panel of our conference and is titled Repairing Economies. Last night, we had a thrilling panel on repairing politics with Professor Mahmood Mamdani and Nandita Sharma. And those of you who haven't had a chance to view it should really not miss out on what were really essential contributions to the task of repairing our damaged politics globally today. The Post-Colonial Higher Education Conference is Habib University's flagship conference. We launched it on the cusp of our inauguration. This year, our theme is Reparative Futures, Decolonial Thought in the Global Ruins. As the chair of this conference, allow me to briefly iterate the rationale behind the conference. We live in a profoundly damaged world. The great acceleration of the Anthropocene has laid bare the extraordinary destruction and radical ruinations that the world has experienced in the modern age. The monumental losses and ruinations of this period go well beyond the biosphere, that is the very ground of all life on the planet. They now manifestly encompass the ruination of polities, economies, societies, ethics, religions, and traditions. The unprecedented modern processes of acceleration and ruination that have brought us to this conjuncture include not just global capitalism, but concurrently the racist phenomena of colonialism and nationalism. Together, they have inaugurated a global form of life in which universal competition and enmity is the real motor of progress, as well as both social and ecological destruction. The stakes could not possibly be higher. The current pandemic has only brought into even greater relief the tremendous injustice and suffering that are endemic to our global form of life. Even as there is now nowhere to hide from the Anthropocene as ecological catastrophe becomes a feature of the quotidian global news cycle. The phrase reparative futures indicated in our title includes both the therapeutic or healing sense of repairing, as well as the ethical and juridical sense of making amends and compensation. The fourth Post-Colonial Higher Education Conference will be a reflection on truth and reparations today, to speak the truth of our condition and its causes, and to reflect on how our anemic world may be repaired for a future of possibilities rather than dead ends. I'll now turn to the chair of this panel on repairing economies, to my distinguished colleague, Professor Aqdas Afzal, who is an assistant professor in the Social Development and Policy Program at Habib, as well as the current director of that program. Professor Afzal is an economist by training, but thankfully of a heterodox sort. Thus, his expansive interests allow him to teach in the university's liberal core curriculum as well. I now ask him to introduce our very distinguished panelists for this session.
Thank you for that very nice introductory remarks and for a very nice and kind introduction, Dr. Naqvi. My name, Adab and good evening. My name is Dr. Aqdas Afzal, and I teach economics and public policy at Habib University. I'm also the program director for Social Development and Policy Program. Before I make a formal introduction of our eminent speakers tonight, I just want to say the following. Economics as a discipline was often known as the dismal science throughout history. And the reason why it was called dismal science had to do with the iron law of wages, which basically said that whenever nominal wages or money wages grew, population also grew as a result, bringing real wages equal to subsistence level. The only time in history before the Industrial Revolution when this iron law of wages was violated was when another pandemic wreaked havoc in Europe. And the name of that pandemic was the Bubonic Plague, or the Black Death, in which fully 30 to 40% of Europe's population perished. We are now facing another pandemic, COVID-19, of massive proportions. Question is COVID-19 going to bring about significant changes in our way of life, in our behavior, in our social, political, and economic institutions? Are we really going to be able to leave behind a more just, equitable, and a sustainable world. With these words, I would like to now introduce the eminent speakers for tonight. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Georgios Kallis, who is an ecological economist, political ecologist, and Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, Barcelona. He is the author of Limits and the Case for Degrowth. His research is motivated by a quest to cross conceptual divides between the social and the natural domains, with particular focus on the political, economic roots of environmental degradation and its uneven distribution along lines of power, income, and class. His current work explores the hypothesis of sustainable degrowth as a solution to the dual economic and ecological crisis. He was previously a Marie Curie Fellow at the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley and holds a PhD in environmental policy from the University of Aegean, an MSc in economics from University Pompeu Fabra, and an MSc in environmental engineering and bachelor's in chemistry from the Imperial College in London. I'm pleased to have him as an eminent speaker tonight. The second eminent speaker tonight is my personal friend, Dr. Sanjay Reddy, who is an associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research in New York. He is an affiliated faculty member of the politics department at the New School and was previously co-academic director of the India-China Institute at the New School. He has also taught in various international academic summer schools and has been a visitor at diverse academic institutions around the world. And we are very thankful to him for participating in this Habib University's conference. He was also elected a fellow of the Human Development and Capabilities Association. He has been a member of various editorial advisory boards, including the American Review of Political Economy, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and Middle East, the European Journal of Development Research, Global Justice, Theory, Practice, Rhetoric, Humanity, the Journal of Globalization and Development, among others. He is also one of the co-founders and team leaders of the Global Consumption and Income Project. I'm pleased to have Dr. Sanjay Reddy as an eminent speaker for tonight's session. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Georgios Kallis for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me in this conference. I feel very pleased and honored to be part of your panel of speakers. I saw an amazing list of speakers and discussions you're having these days. And I have to say I'm particularly pleased to be invited on a conference on presenting post-colonial futures. I guess you invited me because of my work on degrowth, and I know that very often when people hear the word degrowth, they are like, oh, you're oblivious to the plea of nations, developing world or middle-income nations, that they need to grow, and you're speaking from the privilege of someone who is in North Europe, and you're preaching like a kind of a sufficiency or a frugality model, but what about big parts of the world that they haven't reached yet the high income of the European countries, no? And I'm really interested that you find interesting my work on degrowth, and you don't think that it's not interesting because it only speaks to European concerns. And you invite me on a conference on post-colonial futures. So what I want to do today is to present a little bit some of the core ideas we've been working on in this topic or research line, or also kind of advocacy line of degrowth, and link it to questions of critique to colonialism or decolonization. So I want a little bit to show the bridges and why I think it is indeed relevant to talk about degrowth, but talk about degrowth in the particular framework that I will set up here, which is not the way like those who want to criticize degrowth frame it in order to criticize it, which is like, oh, you're calling for negative GDP growth, you know, that it's like a very a very easy puppet to shoot down, no? Like who wants negative GDP growth, and why would it be difficult to bring negative GDP growth? You just shut down the economy and you bring GDP down, no? But of course, that's not what we are talking about here. So first of all, let me say about growth and the way we talk, those of us who have written about the growth since the very first scholar who wrote about the growth in France, because this literature started in France, called the Croissants, was an economic anthropologist, Serge Latouche, who was working in Africa, and he was criticizing, he was part of the school that was called the post-development school in the 1980s and 90s. And he was criticizing what he called the perpetuation of the imaginary of the colonizers, of the colonization imaginary, through the discourse and through the practice of the standard development programs, no? Of the standard model of growth-based development. He observed that in Africa and in Laos, where he did his fieldwork, but he developed a critique to this one-way Western-based and Western inspired model of development. And he, among others, I think most influentially for me, Arturo Escobar, a Colombian scholar who writes in the US, who wrote a book called Encountering Development. They argued that in a way, the colonizing process, after the colonizing forces left, continued in the guise of this development project that the West exported to the rest of the world. And through that continued to control what the West, or the global North, or however you want to call it, the US and Europe, wanted to control, which was a cheap flow of natural and human resources to their economies, no? The maintenance of low prices of labor and low prices of natural resources in order to have growth in the US or in Europe. So there are two critiques of growth that we are being introduced there, and both have a link to the process of colonization. The one is that this imaginary that we say started being constructed with early capitalism in England, no, in 18th century England. Then it's generalized in 20th century. It's a very Western imaginary, and it's an imaginary that had been exported by the colonizing forces and generalized to the rest of the world. And it is the dominant, let's say, the prevalent model of organizing and thinking about the organization of societies now all over the world. So it's a universalized model, the model of GDP growth-based economic development. And there are very few alternatives, even if there are big battles of what's the best way to achieve that, political battles, I would say. There are very few voices that dare to go and question the very model itself. So in one sense, it has been a colonizing imaginary. On the other hand, it has been the actual production of economic growth, because before we started talking about economic growth, because we started talking about economic growth quite recently, like after the 30s and 40s, which is the period after the Great Depression in the US, that economists came together and started trying to measure the economy. Then it's the invention of the indicator of GDP. And these are the first efforts and the first time that we start thinking of a thing out there called the economy, you know, the national economy, and we start measuring it and we start trying to manage it and grow it. This is an idea that appears in the 1930s, and takes off, let's say, in the 1950s in the context of the Cold War, in the one hand, competition between the US and the US part of the world and the Soviet Union part of the world, on who is going to grow their economies faster in a context of military competition, space competition, etc. This is growth as we know it now, but actual growth, like growth of the economy as we can now retrospectively go back and measure it, starts, as we know, with the appearance of capitalism in 18th century England, we might say, and the first time we have the breaking of the iron law of wages and the increase in per capita material living standards is in 19th century England. slowly at the beginning and faster later on, especially with the tapping of fossil fuels, coal initially, and especially oil in the 20th century. This process from the very beginning is integrated with the process of colonization. So those who want to show us only the good side of economic growth or of capitalism would talk about the scientific breakthroughs and the inventiveness of English scientists, no? From the Newtonian revolution to the revolution of the engineers who made the spin wheels in the contact factories produce like 10 times more than they were producing before, faster and faster. And that's one part of the story. But the other part of the story, which I think is quite well established by now, an excellent book that I recently read, but it's not the only one, is Sven Beckert's. He has 2 books, I think, on the history of cotton, no? And he precisely shows how this innovation would not have gone anywhere without, at the same time, 2 very important processes that rested on violence. And one process important, I mean, we know the internal violence, we know the violence of the enclosures within the UK, within England, that produced the extra workforce that went and worked in the factories, in the contour factories and then other factories. This is well established and it's within the canon of, let's say, Marxist political economy. But Sven Beckert brings, and he's not the only one, I'm just using an example of a book I recently read and I really liked, but he brings in the history of cotton 2 parallel processes without which the cotton industry would never have taken place and would never have taken off, and capitalism and economic growth would never have taken off. And it's, on the one hand, the violent appropriation of the Americas, the clearing out of land, and the introduction of slave labor there, which kept the production of the raw material for cotton factories very cheap. And on the other hand, the destruction, the forceful destruction of competitive markets, especially in India, which was dominating the cotton market at the time, and the market of textiles. And it was a market that violently, again, through a process of colonization, disbanded and then became a huge market for the export of the extra surplus that the British factories were producing. And without such a huge market to absorb this extra surplus of production, it wouldn't go anywhere. So what I'm pointing to here is first that the very process of economic growth, we might argue whether this in the long term also brought goods. Of course it brought goods, no? It elevated living standards, first and foremost, where it was supposed to do that in Europe and North America, and then gradually to the rest of the world, it has elevated standards of living and material standards with a huge ecological cost, which is the other part of the question and the one I'm mostly working on. But we have to know that from the very beginning, it built on a huge human cost too. And we shouldn't forget that this process of economic growth from the very beginning, apart from innovation and technological breakthroughs, was tied to human exploitation in the colonies of slave labor, and of course, gender-based exploitation, especially of the unpaid work of women in the household, without which, again, economic production would never have been profitable to the extent that it was, and economic growth would never have taken off. So now this is my analysis of the situation and how I see growth linked to processes of colonization, and how I understand also Serge Latouche's call of degrowth as an effort to decolonize. He said decolonize the imaginary, by which he meant decolonize the idea that the dominant idea that the one-way future is only one of economic growth, the way it has taken place up to now. But I think there is a critic, though, that colonization is not just an idea. No, it's first and foremost a political and a material process, and one that it's inflicted on bodies of people and on whole nations. And in that sense, I would say degrowth is a decolonizing proposal, also in a very material sense. In the material sense that there has to come an end to the continuous exploitation of cheap resources and cheap human labor for the benefit of the global north. And here I enter on my area of expertise and interest. that any future that that involves a continuous compound economic growth in the global north, in high-income countries, means climate disaster, means climate breakdown. I mean, there is a lot of fancy thinking that we might invent some technologies, or we might do some huge leap to clean energy technologies, or we might start absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. All this is super speculative right now. According to all scenarios, we are heading to a 2 degrees Celsius warmer climate by the end of the century, in the best case of scenarios. Otherwise, we are moving to a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius climate change, which can be catastrophic and even make a large part of the planet uninhabitable. Thinking that the currently huge economies of the US and Europe can keep growing at 3% per year, which means that they're going to be 10 times bigger than what they are now by the end of the century, is basically condemning the rest of the planet and those who have less resources right now in their hands to protect themselves from the increasing climate disasters that we are facing, condemns them to a future of destitution, you know. So in that sense, the unwillingness of the West to slow down and degrow, if I want to use this term, the unwillingness of the West to slow down is a continuation of the colonization, of a brutal colonization process, ecological colonization process. We might want to express that in terms of the West continuing to appropriate a bigger and bigger part of what it corresponds to in terms of the global atmospheric commons, but I think there we're just playing the words. It's just shifting the costs and continuing to live at the expense of the world at an unprecedented scale. So those of us who talk about degrowth, we say that we have to start first and foremost from our part of the world, the part of the world that has been responsible for this colonizing project, the part that has lived on the backs of this colonization process, to start this process of decolonization within our part of the world. So to bring the lessons of the decolonization movement and the decolonizing thought back in Europe, where colonization started. And this is what partly we aspire to do with this discourse and thinking around degrowth. I would say the thinking around the degrowth, the ethic around degrowth that I have explored on my book Limits, where I kind of juxtapose a thinking of living simply so that others may simply live, as some people attribute to Gandhi. I couldn't find any citation that Gandhi actually said that, but it is a little bit of a Gandhian thought. So it does express a certain type of thinking that it's non-European, interestingly, and it's the thinking that, you know, we can live better with less if only we organize around that, and this will leave more space to those who still need more in order to have the basics for living a dignified life. I think this has to start from here, from Europe, but it's not just a matter of ethics. So I have one book called Limits, where I kind of make the ethical and philosophical case for this different way of living, and I juxtapose it to the dominant Protestant or Western way of thinking around growth and expansion, around growth and limits, which I attribute to Malthus and in continuation to neoclassical economics, that against the standard story that neoclassical economics, you know, is a different type of economics that separates from Malthus and it's the growth economy versus the previous limited economy, I show like that there is a continuation of this line of thinking, that actually Malthus was the first one who expressed this line of thinking of invoking scarcity in order to constantly justify continuous growth and continuous inequality in the name of promoting this growth. So against this ethic, I propose an ethic of living simply so that others may simply live. The question is, how do we do that? And then a lot of the debate that is going now within the degrowth community is around the ways we might organize. And when I say we, I mean we in our part of the world, in terms of Spain, the US, which were my co-authors with whom we've worked in this direction. Not because what we say doesn't apply to other parts of the world, but because, again, we don't want to produce a discourse that we say it's a universal discourse that should apply everywhere. In different parts of the world, it might apply in different ways. So in our part of the world, we are thinking both of the political processes that can push us in this direction, especially in a context of increasing crises, intensifying crises, especially climate calamities and the related economic calamities that are going to emerge. And we start thinking about policies of what the ecological economist Peter Victor called policies of managing without growth, or what Tim Jackson, another ecological economist that has influenced our line of thinking, called prosperity without growth. So what type of policies, and now I'm shifting a little bit to a more economic discourse, what type of policies can we use to slow down as stably and smoothly as it's possible the growth machine of the global north? And this, I think, links to the topic of reparative economies. I think reparation of the global of the planet and reparation of the economies in our part of the world requires a slowing down, but requires a smooth slowing down, because we know that recession or worse, depression within capitalist systems is catastrophic. But it's really important to start thinking outside of the box, that only thinks that the only response to recession or depression can be growth and expansion, because then we are caught on the same dynamics. So what people like ecological economists like Peter Victor, Tim Jackson, or myself and others argue is that there are, at least potentially, at least let's say as researchers, we should be studying the possibilities of slowing down smoothly or managing without growth. Unfortunately, most of the mainstream economics completely overlook this type of questions, and it's a few people, unfortunately still few, that they look into this question. I hope more and more will be attracted, especially to the extent that the end of growth becomes the reality of parts of Europe. It is the reality right now during the coronavirus crisis, but for some countries like Italy or Japan, it has also been the reality in the last 2 decades. And there is surprisingly little thought on this direction. How do you manage post-growth? How do you manage without growth? The policies we look in our recent book, The Case for Degrowth, are radical policies that others are also looking in slightly different contexts. So it's policies for changing investments, and especially a big investment or an ecological and energy and food transition, what people have called the Green New Deal, but with a different mindset, not with an expansionary mindset. Financed, we discuss in particular the roles of taxing wealth, proposals that they are out there. Again, we're not the first ones to argue this, and the carbon dividend, which means a carbon tax, a big and substantial carbon tax, much more than it's discussed right now, which is returned as a dividend to lower or middle income people. We talk about a universal care income, which is a proposal you might have heard as universal basic income, but we emphasize the point of paying for the unpaid care work that women, but not only women, perform in the household, and the importance of which, not only for economy, but for society at large, were made more than manifested during the current coronavirus lockdown, that most people had to support themselves and take care of themselves inside the household. And we discussed the proposal of reducing working hours, which is something that I have worked extensively with Nicholas Ashford from MIT, proposals for reducing working hours initially to 4 days, 4 days work week. And we discuss policies for supporting the commons and promoting a cooperative economy. So this is a cluster of 5 unorthodox, or you might say, contrarian economic policies that, importantly, we put them in a context of managing without growth and prospering without growth. And this is the political part, or the political economic part of our proposal. Now, how this might happen is the question of politics, which I will leave for the discussion, and I think it's always the most complicated one. But to finish, one point I want to emphasize. What we do say with our work is that it might look very difficult to implement these policies or even bring the political changes to bring such radical policies implemented. It seems impossible, and for good reasons, to change the gear in capitalist economies and turn them into economies that they wouldn't have to grow or die, economies that could manage without growth. It does look impossible. It looks impossible politically, first and foremost, and to a second extent, socially. But the fact that this looks impossible doesn't make possible anymore the alternative, which is the fantasy that the economy can keep growing at 3% per year, 10 times bigger by the end of the century, and that somehow this can magically be greened and not destroy the climate, and with it take down the economy. And also that this can happen without happening at the expense of the rest of the world, as it has happened until now, and our descendants. So the fact that the alternative is impossible, I think, is an invitation for us to think hard how we could make the politically seemingly impossible at least plausible and more possible. Thank you.
Great. I mean, those were some very, very amazing remarks that you just delivered. I was listening with a lot of interest and rapt attention. I'm sure all of our listeners were doing the same. I will be coming back to you after Dr. Sanjay Reddy has had a chance to deliver his remarks. I just want to say that the book that you mentioned by Sven Beckert, the name of the book is Empire of Cotton. And one of our faculty members, Dr. Nauman Beg, actually teaches excerpts from that book in a course that he has developed. It's a great book. I recommend it. Okay, so before I turn over the floor to Dr. Sanjay Reddy, I just want to tell Dr. Kallis that I will have one question after Sanjay's remarks on his book Limits, and one question from his book Degrowth. So I'm just going to give you some tension in advance. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so over to you, Sanjay. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Aqdas. Professor Afzal, I should call you, I'm sure, in this context. And Professor Naqvi, Nauman, both old friends, and of course, Professor Kallis, Georgios. It's been really fantastically interesting morning for me here in New York, where I happen to be, reading Professor Kallis's books, which I should have read a long time ago, and also trying to reflect on this set of very complex questions. I'm not entirely a stranger to this set of issues because I'm a fellow traveler. I was introduced to them first by Tariq Banuri, who was also a mentor of Nauman, I believe, but also others, including the very important members of the group known as IGRI, the International Group for Grassroots Initiatives, which was part of the Society for International Development, now long forgotten, but had many important critical and alternative voices who would be names known to all of you, including, I believe, Ivan Illich at one stage, but also, of course, Smitu Kotari, Majid Ranema, Arturo Escobar, many others, spanning generations. But I have always had also I will admit freely, a little bit of a uncomfortable relation to a number of their theses, which I have always found both provocative and necessary, as Georgios has rightly underlined in his last remarks, but also to be difficult to bring into the here and now in an actionable and perhaps one could also say fully responsible way. And I don't say that it's not possible. I would rather say that there's some very significant unanswered questions which would need to be thought through. And I will return to that. But broadly speaking, one might the concept of aporia, an irresolvable contradiction. There seem to be deep and correctly diagnosed problems with the economic system that we have, but we can neither live with it nor without it. And how to therefore find a way forward in this situation is the question. But again, let me return to that. I would just like to say that it's tremendously important that we have now put at the center of the discussion the question of planetary limits of the economy, which, as Georgios mentions in his written work, and is well known among critical scholars of development and of the economic system, was by and large completely ignored. The few economic theorists such as Georgescu Rogan or others who thought about this question 50 years ago were largely sidelined. And they have been, of course, proved to be extremely prescient in understanding that there are planetary limits, that even with the extraordinary inventive powers of the capitalist economic system, the ability to substitute resources that are dwindling with others and to use fewer of them may have been reaching certain very significant boundaries. And Peter Victor, he's one of those who has thought about this and talked about this very, very sensibly, that even with the lowering of the intensity of resource use per unit of GDP, it's simply a matter of arithmetic, that if one increases the number of units of GDP at the same time, then it is quite possible, and indeed it is the case, that resource use can increase. Resource use has been increasing with respect to many of the critical resources which we have need of, despite that feature. And in fact, let me just show you a picture, since I happen to have it here, and I was told by Nauman that he's been good enough to share, allow me the privilege of sharing my screen. I told him that was a very, what can one say, a very foolhardy thing to do, because I could abuse that power in all sorts of ways. But anyway, here we are. So I'll just, you see, I'm also not very competent at it. I'll show you a picture that demonstrates a little bit what I mean. This is for energy intensity of GDP. And you can see that in the world as a whole, this is the figure I could pull up most easily. But of course, we'd like to have data that goes beyond 2015. This only goes to 2015. For the world as a whole, energy intensity of GDP, the amount of energy used to produce a unit of GDP, has been falling. And quite dramatically, actually, because of better technologies and which use energy less in various domains, but also, of course, because of structural shifts towards services, for instance, and away from manufacturing. Now, that having been said, as Victor and others have demonstrated, it's not enough that the energy intensity must fall if you have an ever-multiplying number of units of GDP, which could cause resource demands also to increase. And this is, of course, not just pertinent to energy, but in many other areas. And note that there are some things that could be done here, which have obviously not been done, which would have helped further. For instance, you can see that OECD countries have lower energy use per unit of GDP than non-OECD countries. So insofar as there were a clean development mechanism, as it was called, which allowed the transfer of resources from, of technologies to produce cleaner units of GDP from rich countries to poor countries or poorer countries, that would also have helped, but we have really not had very much of that kind. So staying within even the conventional parameters of the discourse, there's certainly a case to be answered, which is a very serious case, which Georgios correctly puts forward. Now, if I could shift a little bit to the terrain of economic theory, and ask the question, to what extent has economics as a discipline really anticipated or concerned itself with these issues? I've already mentioned that some of the seers, such as Georgios Kurogan, were sidelined. But one can also say that there was a degree of learnt inability to see these issues. And I'll give one example. There are many examples, but I'll give one example which has long struck me as extremely damning, and yet it is hardly noticed in economic seminar rooms, in universities, not to mention in policy-making institutions, whether in national governments or international institutions such as the World Bank. And this concerns what is called discounting of the future. If we're trying to ask the question, or if we're asking the question, what should we do in order to protect the interests of future generations? Well, the economist's answer to that, the conventional economist's answer to that, is to ask what level of welfare people in the future are likely to have under different possible courses of action, but then to compare that welfare with the welfare of people in the present by adopting a discounting mechanism which treats it as being worth less than the welfare of people in the present. And it might strike a number of lay people that that's not a completely obvious thing to do, because parents don't always treat their children's interests as being worth less than their own. But this is exactly what the framework demands. And one reason for that is that it makes for for simple answers to be identified within the standard approach. But it's entirely blind to the kind of concerns of obligation or responsibility which reparative futures, the theme which has been very rightly chosen for this conference, would seem to suggest that we should put at the center. And indeed, Georgios in his work has emphasized the need to move beyond a narrowly utilitarian way of seeing in thinking about the economy and thinking about society and our responsibilities within it. What would this imply in this scenario? Well, it would imply, for instance, it could imply something like what the Iroquois nation in North America, indigenous people of North America, put forward as the seventh generation rule, or what has come to be known as that, namely that one should consider the consequences of one's actions on all future generations up to 7 generations hence. And this would have a very different implication from discounting. Why? Well, discounting tells us, even if the rate of discounting is relatively favorable to future generations, that if you go far enough into the future, future generations don't count at all. It's perfectly all right to bury nuclear waste under the ground, or indeed to allow catastrophic climate change to happen, as long as it affects people who are far enough away in the future, right? And this is the framework which is used in an absolutely standard way in economics. And for example, one instance of that is Nick Stern's famous review of the economics of climate change, which applied such a discounting framework. And then as a consequence, the whole debate among economists became one of what the discount rate should be. Should it be 2% or 3%? And what would be the implications of the choice of different discount rates with respect to what we should do today? But as I have just noted, there's a completely different way of approaching the issue, which says no to the discount rate and asks instead, from a non-utilitarian point of view, as Georgios rightly asks us to adopt, what are our responsibilities? And if we were to think about our responsibilities in a chain of intergenerational obligations of this kind, right, what would we be required to leave to our children, grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so on, by way of an adequate world? With, for instance, that might mean a world that is not completely deforested, right? And of course, we may also have obligations to trees or to species to not eliminate them entirely from the earth. But putting that aside, even from a narrowly, from a point of view which is concerned primarily with the obligations of humans to other humans, this would lead to a very, very different way of thinking. So this is merely an example. William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize in Economics, by the way, the Swedish Bank Prize in Economics, for having worked on a model as to what we should do in response to climate change, which involved exactly the kind of discounting which I'm mentioning. Now, Georgios rightly also pointed to the fact that rapid economic growth has been a modern phenomenon, largely. Of course, there are debates as to when it began and how much economic growth there was in history, even prior to the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith, who's writing before the British Industrial Revolution, does write about the last 2 centuries, the period of the Commercial Revolution, as having involved some amount of economic growth. And if you look at what scholars such as Jairus Banerjee or others argue, there have certainly been signs of continuity in the nature of economic systems and perhaps in the propensity to accumulation over much longer periods. But be that as it may, without resolving that issue, it's quite clear that something epochal and transformative happened. And of course, following Smith, Ricardo is deeply concerned with the question of improvement, how it is that countries can in effect grow. And the consequence, as Georgios pointed out, is that we have now a world which is very unequal as a result of economic growth having taken place in some places and not in others. And whether, of course, it's been repressed in other places as a result of economic growth having happened where it did is also an interesting question, which Georgios made a comment in regard to. And I'm just going to show you again, and please excuse me for this toggling back and forth, but another slide which is pertinent here. And this is a slide of the per capita income of countries in the world. And you can see that it is very unequal. The dots are color-coded. Each dot is a country. The high-income countries, so-called high-income countries, according to the World Bank definition, I have quite a quibble with that definition, but the so-called high-income countries are all described here by the purple dots, and then the turquoise dots are the so-called upper middle-income countries, the green dots, the so-called lower middle-income countries, and the red dots, the so-called low-income countries. And you can see that actually there's not that much of a gap in absolute income terms between many of the countries in the latter three categories. Most of the gap in absolute terms occurs actually within the so-called high-income countries. So you can see why category. So you can see why I have a difficulty with that. But certainly, this picture underlines that there cannot be a single prescription the world over, and insofar as higher material living standards can be, when adequately distributed, consistent with betterment of human lives, we would not want to discount that presumably as a possibility. And indeed, in the writings on degrowth that I have read of Georgios and others, they are at pains to state that they are not discounting that they're not against growth, they're just against growth as a fetish, growth as the dominant sign, so to speak, under which or the dominant idea under which all of our other thinking and actions are organized, and the turning of it into an objective in and of itself. We know from a variety of sources that while it is possible, for instance, to achieve high levels of life expectancy even at lower levels of income and other indicators of human well-being, there are some relations between income and these achievements. And I'm going to show you now a picture of, which, by the way, just shows up immediately if you Google Pakistan per capita income. This is what comes up on the Google screen at the very top. I didn't create this picture. Pakistan's per capita income relative to India's and Bangladesh's. This is in purchasing power parity units. It reflects also, I suspect, the prior PPP base year that was in use, because there was recently a controversy about Bangladesh's per capita income having exceeded India's according to the most recent PPP base year calculations. And clearly that's not the case in this diagram, but that's a technical issue. The important point is this. You can see that these countries have had different trajectories. And let's focus on Bangladesh and Pakistan. Bangladesh had a lower per capita income than Pakistan in 1990. In fact, even more markedly the case if you go back further, and it has exceeded Pakistan now quite a little bit. Of course, in terms of life expectancy, it is doing even better, 5 years higher life expectancy, 72 as opposed to 67 years. Now, it's really very difficult for me to imagine doing an analysis of the two countries and their trajectories and what it is that's made the difference, whether development in one case has been adequately inclusive or as inclusive as it could be in comparison with the other case, or whether it has been adequately successful in terms of providing the conditions of flourishing lives without looking at all of these elements together, which is to say, even if we do not fetishize per capita income, we would need to understand what is going on in Bangladesh, which is different from what is going on in Pakistan. Now, as many of you know, Bangladesh was a social development success much before it was an economic success. And so that suggests that there may, if anything, be a causal arrow running in the other direction from social development, for instance, improvements in women's health and education and per capita income. But all of this would need to be studied. It's very hard to imagine putting to one side altogether the analysis of GDP per capita, or even the inclusion of it as an objective among others in an adequately balanced and variegated point of view on development. Now, let me, in this connection, just tease you a little bit with the following list. I was thinking about the different ways in which those who have been discontented with development over many, many years, over decades, have tried to express their discontent. And there's a very, very long list of phrases which they have used at different times. And I'm going to read you that list, not in a strictly chronological order, but in a way that roughly captures the dimensions of that discontent and its history. Okay? There was, of course, development, and then there was community development, and then there was growth with redistribution, and then there was participatory development, and then there was another development, and then there was alternative development, and then there was people-centered development, and then there was sustainable development, and then there was pro-poor growth, and then there was equitable growth and development, and then there was inclusive growth and development, and then there was human development, and then there was sustainable human development, and then there were sustainable livelihoods, and then there was anti-development, and then there was post-development, and then there was buen vivir, and then there was Ubuntu, and then there was degrowth. Now, if we ask the question, have we now found the linguistic salve which will forever free us from the inadequacies of development as we know it? That it is, to use some of the words which I just used, not sufficiently inclusive, not sufficiently sustainable, not sufficiently oriented toward the flourishing of the vast majority and the maintenance of a proper relation with nature. And an adequate also concern with our inheritances and traditions and the maintenance of social and cultural ends which we may have. I think the answer is the terminology doesn't by itself provide us very much of a solution. And I come back here to the question of aporia, right? The irresolvable contradiction. We can't live with it, nor can we live without it. And so we're always looking for another language with which to express our aspirations for a different kind of a world. And that's necessary. It's necessary for us to be utopians in order to live in the present. But it is also necessary for us to find the practical resources of thought with which to guide our actions in the present too. Not only, in other words, to find new language, but also to find new practices. And of course, the language can help to guide the practices. We could go into each and every one of the terms that I mentioned and discuss its limitations, discuss the ways in which it is it was susceptible to or redolent of, right? Dependent on some set of assumptions which we find improper, disagreeable, incorrect. But if we want to find a way forward, we will have to, I think, go underneath the hood, so to speak. We will have to think less about language and more about practices, which is not to say that the practices are not important for us to consider. If I may put the point in a slightly different way, if development, conventionally understood, is the thesis, and each of these is the antithesis, what is the synthesis? And how will we find it? If one reads Georgios's work, I think there's a very sophisticated effort to avoid the idea that degrowth is simply an antithesis, and to suggest that it contains, in fact, a number of aspects of synthesis. But I think that that is exactly what will have to be elaborated, right? I think of, for instance, also my friend from a very long time ago, though I've not been in much touch, Kate Rayworth's work on what she calls donut economics, which is another way of describing these questions of what is of maintaining the appropriate proportionality between what is needed for human flourishing and what is needed for respect for nature. I think a very important point in Georgios' work, which he didn't manage to mention because of lack of time, but I think is really crucial, is the idea that degrowth is a political and not just a technical project. It could not, by its very nature, be a technical project. It's a political project and it's a social project. But I think this is hugely important. This is a theme which cuts through all the critical strands, which I just mentioned, that idea. And it puts, well, whether you want to call it development or you want to call it simply the project of developing the conditions of economic prosperity and flourishing, it puts it in its appropriate place, gives it a democratic cast. I'm sure that I'm running out of time, so let me just end by bringing in the question of political economy, which Georgios said he would leave to the discussion. So I'll just raise it now for us to try to enter into in the discussion more fully. It seems to me that this is really an absolutely central question. One of the things that I learned from one of my teachers, at least, was that Stephen Margolin used to like to mention this point, was that growth is a salve for distributional conflict, or it's an outlet, rather, we might say. Because insofar as there is a desire on the part of some to have more, that is attainable without taking away resources from others insofar as there is growth. Now, of course, that's in theory, insofar as we're thinking about the question merely arithmetically. But growth in practice doesn't happen in this arithmetical way of constituting a simple expansion which brings about what economists call a Pareto improvement, more for some and not less for others. Sometimes it brings about less for others, and that's what we call maldevelopment. And there are many, many examples of that around the world, as you know, whether it's to do with palm oil plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia, or whether it's to do with fisheries off the coast of Africa, which are being fish stock, which are being swept up by trawlers, contributing to the economic growth somewhere. Recently, there was a scandal. I participated in a very interesting discussion with the Icelandic whistleblower about this, a scandal that tied Iceland and Namibia improbably, because an Icelandic fishing company was involved in paying very large bribes to Namibian officials so as to be able to engage in fishing offshore of Namibia. And of course, that was essentially a sale of the country's resources so as to pad particular pockets, which ended up presumably also harming ordinary fisherfolk in Namibia. But it's certainly not the case that a Pareto improvement, betterment for all, is what we observe in the world. But insofar as growth mutes distributional conflict, it's one of the political reasons that politicians seek growth. And we have to, I think, understand that. Now, of course, all of that is within the context of a presumed attitude of the Homo economicus, so to speak, which involves greed rather than need, or at least perceived need, with demanding and some degree of additional resources. I think also of what Ragnar Nurksa, the development economist, called the international demonstration effect. He was referring to Latin America, I think in particular Colombia, in the early 1950s, late 1940s and early 1950s, where the elite were very conscious of what the American middle classes were consuming. And insofar as the American middle classes all had cars and refrigerators, they also required cars and refrigerators. And of course, one may say good things on behalf of cars and refrigerators. But the point here is simply that the American middle class set a consumption norm which they wish to emulate. And that desire to emulate that consumption norm in turn had massive economic and political implications, because it meant, for instance, a drain of foreign exchange to pay for imported goods in that context. And as a result, these countries, and this has been a persistent pattern in Latin America, but also for developing countries all over the world, including Pakistan, have ended up in a persistent difficulty of paying their foreign exchange bills, as a consequence of which they have had to reorient their entire economies, partly because of external conditionalities, partly because of the inherent demands of that kind of obligation in a certain direction, right? To become export-oriented, to borrow, and so forth. And of course, some countries, such as the neo-mercantilist countries in East Asia, have been much more successful at that. But again, largely because the development project they pursued was a political project which was governed by the state and not merely by particular self-interested elites. So for all of these, or let us say interested elites, for all of these different kinds of reasons, the political economy of growth, why it is that we are hooked on growth, so to speak, regardless of its costs, remains, I think, to be fully illuminated. I think in every country in the world today, practically zero growth on the current pattern would be a social crisis and an economic crisis, because it would mean increasing levels of unemployment, not merely a steady level of unemployment. We demand and we need or require growth on the existing pattern of how economies operate, simply in order to stay still, in order for unemployment not to increase. There is, so to speak, a non-accelerating unemployment rate of growth, which is positive. And this is therefore a treadmill we can't get off unless we have fundamentally different patterns that are brought in. So all of this, I think, requires much deeper analysis, but is absolutely central to the question of reparative futures. I like very much the emphasis on futures from this point of view, that it is a call to reimagine and to avoid the mistakes of the past. I have not discussed at all the other questions, other aspects of reparation, historical and societal, to do with the precedents of particular groups and the advantages and disadvantages they have realized as a result. But maybe that too will come in the discussion. And finally, let me just say, quoting William Shakespeare, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So whether we call it degrowth or call it something else, let's focus on what is the content of it. Thank you.
Great remarks, Dr. Sanjay Reddy. I was reminded when you talked about international demonstration effects of the work of another very interesting economist whose name was Veblen, who talked about keeping up with the Joneses, which could be construed as international demonstration effects in an international context. But I was reminded of Veblen's work when you talked about that. Very, very interesting and significant remarks. I'm now going to turn to Professor Georgios Kallis and ask, two questions, if I may. So, okay, let's see, where did I write those down? Okay, so one of the neoclassical explanations of, how should I say, this exponential increase in the quality of life is Europe breaking free from a Ricardian Malthusian paradigm. So for our, basically through technological innovation by, invention of the steam engine, so they were able to harness fossil fuels. I think in the interest of our viewers' edification, I would let you describe the mainstream or the standard interpretation of Malthus, because you write about this in Limits, and how does your interpretation differ from that? So that's my first question. I'll let you answer that, and I'll go to the next question.
It's a big question because I have to summarize a full book in 2 minutes. The main argument of my book is that in the standard history, Malthus has passed as someone who was writing just before capitalism or industrial revolution started, and he was describing the world of his time, and he was describing a world where there were limits in food production, and these limits in food production and there was overpopulation, and people were breeding too many children, and this was leading occasionally to famines, and that we were stuck in this perpetual world of poverty, and that it was impossible to grow the production of food, or impossible to grow with technology the use of resources, and therefore grow the economy. This is how it's typically portrayed, no? And then the next step is like, yes, but the Malthus was wrong, because immediately after he was writing, or at the time he was writing, industrial revolution was starting, and then these limits became less and less relevant, and population grew, and there weren't famines, at least always talking about England, no? Because in the rest of the world continued to be famines and related to England and Malthusian line of thinking, but that's a different story. So that's the standard story. In my book, following the lead of others, I reread the essay of Malthus, and I found actually that the argument is quite different from that. So many people who have studied Malthus seriously, his biographers, also his intellectual followers, etc., have made the point, but it hasn't got registered, that actually the way Malthus has come to us is mostly through the debate that started in the 1970s around the environment, and the so-called neo-Malthusians, who made arguments similar to that, saying that if the population keeps increasing, it's going to crash because the world is limited, etc. But the people who have studied Malthus argue that Malthus was not at all someone who was thinking along these lines. And this line of thinking is attributed to the essay on population, which was the first book that made Malthus famous. But of course, for those of you, you're all political economists, you know that Malthus wrote also other books, and they had not at all the scent of limits on them. I mean, Keynes was notoriously inspired for his work on government spending, etc., from Malthus, who was arguing along these lines. And Malthus actually was against Ricardo. He didn't believe in diminishing returns to agriculture, which is it's very interesting. Like Malthus would say, no, I don't see any limits in the production of agriculture, and we can keep increasing food production as much as we want. And this is also what he wrote in the essay. So in one sense, Malthus was a growthist, if we can use this term, of his time, which led me to reread the essay and try to interpret it a little bit more closely to the text, rather than our wishful interpretations or wishful caricature characterizations of who Malthus is and what's his role in the development of the history of ideas. And what you find is a slightly different argument, which is very similar to the argument the neoclassical economists made ever after. And his argument is that we have a natural instinct to have as many children as possible, because it's the natural instinct of sex that God has instilled on us. Because God's wish is that we multiply and populate the earth, the Christian God in this case.
Right.
And this instinct leads to an asymmetry between population and the possibility of producing food. And in order to resolve this asymmetry, this scarcity, what economists call scarcity, forces us to be industrious and produce more and more, which is the only thing we can do in the light of this asymmetry between our instinct and the possibilities of the world outside of us. So what I argue there is that Malthus's argument was actually an argument where he invoked scarcity and limits in order to legitimate and explain why we need to continuously grow the economy. And that's the argument of economics ever since.
Okay, awesome. I am going to, I'm not going to ask the next question on your next.
Yes, sorry for that. That was long, but you know, it's not. my best I've done is 5-minute summary of my book, but now you asked me for 1 minute, and that was
great,
that was impossible.
a great elevator pitch, by the way. I think a lot of people are going to buy your book now. I'm not going to ask you the next question on your second book, Degrowth, because I think they're going to take some time. I'm, however, going to ask you a question about political economy and the politics of all of this. You know, when it comes to reparative futures, or repairing the global economy or having a reparative future, where is it needed the most? That's my number one question. Where is it needed the most? Who should benefit the most? Number one. How should they benefit? And three, how to start the process of reparations or repairing the economy. So, I mean, just to get your thoughts on the political side of the discussion.
Yeah, I think Sanjay can answer this much better than I, because it's a question also of the political economy, the global political economy and the redistribution. But to the extent that I can, and it's not the area that I have been thinking the most. But I think the way I would think around it as an ecological economist is that the reparations have to start from the places where the global north is mostly ecologically indebted to. So we talk about financial debt, but we have to think about ecological debt. And there is a huge ecological debt that the global north has, and carbon debt in terms of emissions, that the global north has to repay to the rest of the world. So the reparation has to be paid to the places that, and paid, I don't mean in dollar terms necessarily or in money terms, but the reparation has to start from the places that have been ravaged through an unequal ecological exchange in order to permit the growth that has been possible in the global north. And starting from there. Now, how my colleague Jason Hickel, who has written an excellent book on inequality and development, he argues that not against foreign aid, but against the myth of aid, that the global north is giving supposedly aid to the global south. And he shows with data that with the one hand, global north is giving foreign aid, but with the other hand, it's taking much more back through repatriated profits, through corruption and transnational capital moves, through unequal exchange of natural resources and underpaying for resources that it gets, etc. So just fixing some of these things, and we're talking just about the clear illegalities of the current system, no, or limiting the repatriation of profits or limiting the flows of capital, etc. I think just that can go to a long way of, at least in money terms, equalizing the situation to one extent. But I think there is a case of thinking broadly, more broadly, of the type of reparations with which the global north can start compensating, and again, I don't mean only in monetary terms, for the ecological damage that it has caused and the forthcoming climate disasters.
I think that this is breaking up a little, or at least
Thanks.
Okay, sorry. I think there was some internet problems at my end. I apologize, but great. Thank you for that answer. I am going to now move very quickly and go to Professor Sanjay Reddy and accost him with something that he wrote very, very recently. Well, actually, he gave a keynote address to an organization in which he talked about return of the normative. And so very quickly, if you could tell us why this is the time for return of the normative, and if you could quickly tell us, what do you mean when you say, for our audience, when you say return of the normative? In a post-COVID-19 scenario in which you were basically building this case. Thank you.
So Aqdas, in that particular article, I was indeed talking about how COVID-19 has brought to the fore certain kinds of societal questions, especially involving distribution of burdens and benefits between different groups and persons, which are otherwise obscured or hidden. And this point does in fact connect to our discussion on growth, because I think one of the ways in which growth fetishism, the single-minded focus on growth as the objective to be pursued, functions politically and socially, is to push to the side all of these distributional and other questions of weighing of different kinds of values and the role of distinct values in society, which could otherwise should otherwise be addressed, because of the premise that if only there's more, then one can address all of the objectives or ends that there are without having to face these difficult questions of weighing. I alluded to this earlier, of course, in relation to how growth and distribution can be seen as substitutes in some sense politically. And so I pointed out that simply that governments have been making demands on particular groups to experience burdens of various kinds, presumably because there would be benefits, but very often those benefits are experienced by other groups. And so the entire exercise is heavily political. It calls on people, of course, to also mobilize their sense of fellow feeling and sense of responsibility toward others and so on. But it's heavily political, heavily societal. It is not the usual obscurantism of economic values, of economism, as Georgios and his colleagues rightly call it, right? Drawing on an earlier tradition, Godelier and Gortz and many others referring to economism. Right? It's not the primacy of the economic, but the primacy of the political and the social. So as I suggest in that piece, a crisis has made that an unavoidable fact that has to be paid attention to, that there are these choices to be made. But it's always the case, it's simply obscured, right? And so I use the phrase, the return of the repressed, drawing on that metaphor. But in some sense, Georgios's proposal and the proposal of the degrowth movement is a deeper kind of recollection or bringing to the fore of something that's much more submerged, that is even in everyday times really unattended to.
Great. This is going to be my last question, and it's addressed to Dr. Sanjay Reddy. Recently in the Wall Street Journal, there was a piece which argued that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been developed only because of capitalism's incentives. I'm sure you have seen that piece in the Wall Street Journal because it is your favorite paper. My question to you is, COVID-19, is it going to destroy capitalism, or is capitalism going to destroy COVID-19?
Well, I don't know if either of them is going to destroy the other. That may be the apocalyptic thinking which Nauman has infected you with, Aqdas, that you are looking to the immediate collapse of one or the other. But no, indeed.
So the question, as you rightly understand, is COVID-19 going to bring about the recalibration in global political and economic institutions to make this world a more just, equitable, and sustainable world? Or is COVID-19 just a dot on the radar screen that is going to fade just like any other ship in the night?
Okay, thank you. Sorry for deflecting the question improperly earlier, but indeed, it's a good question. I think one way to see the problem is that it's, so to speak, exacerbating the contradictions or the conflicts which exist. For instance, if you think about the huge buildup of debt which has taken place on the part of countries and firms and individuals as a result of the crisis, this creates conditions which demand some sort of a political response and different kinds of economic policies. And if those alternative policies are not forthcoming, I think we can anticipate quite a lot of churning in the social and political sphere, and very, very intense demands coming forward. So I think that that those conditions which it has created are fertile, so to speak, for a re-envisioning of the international economic order, but also domestic economic choices and social and political choices as a consequence. But of course, it remains to be seen exactly what will happen. But I think that's quite possible. Now, on the question of vaccines, which you mentioned, I haven't actually seen that particular article, but I've seen enough articles like it by various people, just to note that there's a very, very long history, including in regard to the biotechnology which is being used in these very vaccines, of public sector research and development. having been highly successful. So much of what we see as a private sector achievement is, in fact, as we all know, underpinned, because it's been well demonstrated by many scholars, underpinned by a lot of public research and development effort. And indeed, it's really because of the last 30 to 40 years of neoliberal, so to speak, a dismantling of public research and development establishments that's not more visible. There are many countries in which these establishments were literally dismantled. Canada, to take one example, it had its own research and development lab, which was very important in producing certain vaccines and drugs in the past, Connaught Labs, and it was dismantled as part of a conservative move against state-owned enterprises and public institutions of various kinds in the early 1980s. And in part as a result, Canada does not have the domestic infrastructure today to produce its own vaccines, which is why it's lagging so far behind the United States, despite having made the highest number of advanced purchases per capita from private vaccine manufacturers of any country in the world. And that reflects the importance of having that public capability, which it has lost. So now belatedly, it's trying to establish that public capability. So I think these are, again, also examples of what Georgios referred to as getting away from economism, not in his remarks, but in his written work. To the extent that we view the provisioning of essential resources to people as a social and political imperative. And I think that's at the heart of the degrowth idea, right? Provisioning as one of the main imperatives. That leads us in a different direction, because a provisioning economy, whether it's of drugs which are the frontier drugs and vaccines that are available, or whether it's the most basic things such as food, will require some degree of public attention to the way in which the system as a whole operates, systemic thinking, which cannot be, by definition, provided by decentralized private actors. And we have seen exactly that failure, not just at the level of firms, but at the level of countries, of decentralized action in this crisis.
Right. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague and the chair of this conference, Dr. Nauman Naqvi.
Thank you, Aqdas. Thank you, Professors Kallis and Reddy, for these excellent presentations. So much to think about with each and across each. So I just want to make some brief remarks and ask a question. So I take it that, so one of the problems, thank you for the theme of economism, Redus, and returning to that again and again. Day before yesterday, in our panel on repairing the biosphere, in which we learned that we cannot repair the biosphere, we can only repair ourselves. Yeah, the biosphere can only take care of itself. Because repairing the biosphere suggests genetic engineering, geoengineering. Yeah, it seems to have those kinds of connotations. This was usefully pointed out to us by Jean-Baptiste Pressot, who's an environmental historian who works on the Anthropocene, written a book called The Shock of the Anthropocene. We were discussing scientism. Yeah, the question of scientism came up, which in fact the question of geoengineering is tied to. So there are these various, I mean, of course, if modernity is anything, the modern period is anything, it's a period of ideologies also. So you have, historicism, scientism, Marxism, it's a proliferation of isms, yeah. Scientism, economism. Now, degrowth, so what has happened actually with the growth of economism, first in the 19th century and really quite definitively over the course of the 20th century and really towards the end of the 20th century. Yeah, so it's as if as the centuries have grown over the past couple of centuries, yeah, especially over the course of the 20th century, economism has kind of completely dominated the field. Yeah, whereas of course, as we know, the initial thinkers of economics never thought of themselves as economists. They were philosophers. And thankfully, both of you, of course, are not just economists. You are, in fact, philosophical economists. So, in fact, you are returning to that more noble tradition, one might say, right, with which your disciplines began. Yeah, with which your discipline began. So, I take it that degrowth is really about a question. First of all, it's a question of the form of life. Yeah. Which is, of course, the first concern of philosophy. Yeah. Philosophy, as Pierre Hadot has shown about ancient philosophy or pre-modern philosophy. Yeah. Philosophy is always about philosophy as a way of life. So philosophy always is a question. Yeah. Of the form of life. Yeah. As well as a political question, because the form of life is a political question. Yeah. So with that in mind, yeah, what has happened over the modern period, or what is happening now? So first of all, this remarkable growth of, to mention just one text, David Button's Power, Pleasure, and Profit. The appetites from Machiavelli to Madison. Yeah. So completely new kind of view of human nature. Yeah. And the purpose of human life. Yeah. Which is quite unprecedented. Became normalized amongst philosophical thinkers. Yeah. There's also the recent book, The Enchantments of Mammon. Yeah. An excellent Eugene McCarter, How Capitalism Became the Religion. Yeah. Became a religion. In fact, a lot of, because as I see it, when you talk about growth, there's also the question of aggregation. Yeah, you're talking about aggregating very, very large numbers of people who live a plurality of existences. This is also something that the post-development school, including Serge Latouche, point out, who might not necessarily want to be aggregated in this fashion. Because we don't really, we don't have one form of life, we have a varieties of forms of life. And there's also the question, what has actually been happening for a lot of people is that their levels of subsistence, and precisely because of ecological destruction also, levels of subsistence have been lowered for a lot of people. Yeah. So first is a problem of aggregation. But also, and I'm very, very happy with the reference to Gandhi, yeah, that Georgios made, since again, that's a political question. Actually, it's remarkable the way in which we are extremely cautious these days about making political suggestions or gesturing towards new kinds of political projects. Clearly, just 70 years ago, people were not so shy. Yeah, Gandhi. Yeah, this extraordinary political project that he undertook. Whether he was sidelined by history or not. Yeah, it was an absolutely essential contribution to the possibility of decolonization, not just, of course, in South Asia, but everywhere in the world. Yeah, and there's a good reason that Kallis has also brought up Gandhi even today. And philosophical projects, and the reference to Gandhi also reminds us that it was also a religious project. Yeah. So this is the other thing that has happened. Yeah, is that nationalism, for instance, has co-opted religion for the purposes of growth. Yeah, actually, I was saying in one of the earlier sessions, just before the conference began, the language of growth, the extent to which it has come to dominate human perception, human cognition. Yeah, human cognition. Nobody goes around saying, there was a 6% growth in my cancer last year. Yeah. Hardly anybody would boast about that, I would imagine. Yet we know that this is what, I mean, this is what it means today. This is what growth means today. Yeah, it's not just destroying the planet; it's destroying human society. Yeah, globally. I mean, I don't think that we can disengage the horrific political developments that are underway all over the world. I think in India, actually, for example. What is happening in India is a direct result of growth. Yeah, I can't imagine, in fact. Yeah, so I would say that in fact we shouldn't. I mean, this is precisely a time. I mean, I in a class that I was teaching, which was called the Modernocene. We read a book called Death and the Afterlife by an analytic philosopher, Samuel Scheffler. Who argues that in fact our current form of life, which has no future, if we really start to believe, which is I think increasingly the case, yeah, if we really start to believe that there are not going to be future generations, yeah, our own lives today would stop making sense to us. And in fact, we would find, and he shows at length, and I think this is true, yeah, that human motivation would in fact deteriorate and eventually disappear. Yeah, it is precisely with the possibility of posterity that the meaning of our lives now, yeah, is possible. If there was actually no posterity, I believe this is really true. Yeah, what is happening is growth of nihilism everywhere. You can see it. I mean, it's just last night I was watching with my wife that marvelous documentary, 2018 documentary that Lauren Greenfeld made, Generation Wealth. Yeah, just the revolting forms of life that have evolved in the United States. Yeah, over the past few decades. I mean, just horrific lives. Yeah, I mean, it's people with enormous amounts of money. Yeah, or lived ruinous lives. This is the case in the United States. Yeah, there have been there's well documented now. Yeah, and of course, all of this runs completely counter to what human civilization had been about until this, the past couple of 100 years. Yeah. And I think, in fact, nationalism and this capitalism go very well together, racial capitalism. And at the heart of it is this idea of all of us becoming like, white societies. Yeah, growth is closely tied to that. Yeah. So I think this we shouldn't be shy from kind of radical questioning. Yeah, of the current form of life, given the fact that it is we are at such a critical moment in human history. Thank you for those really amazing presentations.
Okay, great. Thank you for your comments. Would either of our two eminent speakers like to reply to Dr. Nauman Naqvi's remarks?
I might have something to say, but perhaps after Georgios, if you would like to comment.
Sure.
No, I think I agreed a lot. So I want, yes, I was keeping references of what you were referring to look into these books, etc. So I think I don't have much to comment on, to say that we're in the same line, and I'm happy to hear that.
Okay, so it's Sanjay, I guess, your turn.
So let me just also say what privilege it is, as always, to hear Nauman's thoughtful expositions, bringing to and pressing concerns. I think of all of them, one that I might speak to now is this question of diversity of forms of life, which is being steamrollered as a result of global modernity, global capitalist modernity, with a Western, of course, face to it very often, most often. And I think this is a very important question for political theory, for sociology, and the social sciences at large, and even for economics, but which is largely sidelined because of the parochial nation and also Western-centric forms of questions that we do ask. One way to think about it is that there's deep diversity and shallow diversity. We're all preoccupied nowadays with, so to speak, shallow diversity, what is referred to under the heading of identity politics and representational politics of various kinds. And we're not asking about whether we have diversity of forms of life, the Wittgensteinian phrase which Nauman rightly evoked, which has to do with practices, self-understandings, not only individual, also collective, which represent true civilizational diversity and part of the inheritance of humankind. And so whatever one's specific views on particular aspects of those, and we're all critical of aspects of these collective inheritances, global and collective treasure house, so to speak, which if we steamroller away, we will be impoverished by. And I think that point about the direction we're heading, where consumerism and the form of life, the form of valuation of life that it entails, where having the right sneakers or whatever it is becomes the measure of a life, as opposed to being able to, let us say, grapple with the eternal questions within one's own civilizational key, the perennial questions, which Georgios also talks about quite a lot in his work. This idea of the dépense, I think it is, of turning the social surplus toward those kinds of concerns. That's nowhere on the horizon. So I think a more reflective kind of a framework of thought in the social sciences and individual life, in collective deliberation, would be helpful. Let me turn just a moment toward India, since it was mentioned, and I happen to have a small connection to that country, as you do also. Nauman made a very important point, an interesting point about growth fetishism and what role that's played in contemporary India. I was very struck 2 election cycles ago, and 3, that there emerged a very simplistic framing for political reasons of a certain political party as being for growth and other political parties as being, in particular, one other political party as being against growth, as if anyone in either political party was only for growth, as if that were the only value they had, or indeed against growth, which those accused of that didn't especially suffer from either. As far as I could see, they were also rather growth-centric themselves. But it was very interesting that emerged as the framing, a dominant discourse in politics, because of the quasi-religious content that growth has come to have. And of course, this raises the troubling and difficult issue Nauman has pointed to as to what is the connection to identity politics, which is so hard to really make sense of fully. There isn't a direct line, but there are indirect links perhaps between these. Many, many, many years ago, I happened to take a wonderful car ride with Ajit Singh, the distinguished British economist of Indian origin, British Indian economist, perhaps I should say, who also, by the way, was a graduate of Howard University, the historically African-American university in Washington, D.C., and a heterodox economist. Aqdas would know him. And he had the misfortune, I was driving a car, and I was driving very badly. But anyway, we won't get into that. The important point is that I had a little discussion with him on culture and the economy. He's since passed away, unfortunately. And his notion was that only by having economic growth could, in a particular country or in a particular part of the world, could it be the case that the culture that was identified with it or with which it was associated could begin to command respect. Now, this in turn generates what we mean by respect. And certainly there is some evidence that Ajit Singh's thesis is true, in the sense that as, for example, China's star has risen or India's star is rising, we can see a different attitude in the West and in the North, partly self-interested, to these civilizations and societies. But it also does again call upon us, I think, to consider what would be the conditions of mutual respect that were not dependent on that in world society, and how can we cultivate that? And with that, again, impossible to answer or aporetic problem, I turn it back to the seers, Nauman and Aqdas, and Georgios, of course.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for very interesting comments. I just wanted to say two things. First of all, I'd just like to thank Sanjay Reddy for being very generous as far as sharing his teaching materials with me over the years is concerned. It has helped me in designing my courses at Habib University. I actually teach excerpts from Jason Hickel's book, and I have the good news to share with Dr. Georgios Kallis that I'll be using a lot of his works now for my course, Political Economy of Development, and we'll also be reaching out to both of you for at least one guest appearance in my courses. So, you remain engaged with Habib University. Okay, so I would be remiss if I did not take my colleague's question, who's actually been sending a few comments to me via chat, and I would like to take Dr. Shah Jamal Alam's comment, rather. I would like to read his comment, which is about Malthus's work. He says, shouldn't Malthus be interpreted through his 19th century influence for Darwin, Wallace, Spencer? Not just him as an advocate for growth, as Professor Kallis has explained in his book. So, I mean, he's making a case that Malthus should be interpreted along evolutionary lines, so to speak. I don't know if Dr. Kallis would like to respond to that comment. Thank you.
Yeah, it's well known that, but it's underappreciated. So it's a good point of Professor Alam to say that the connection between Darwin and Malthus is not always appreciated, although historically it's a well-known fact that Darwin said that he owns the inspiration for his theory of evolution as a struggle for survival to Malthus' essay on population. So he understood from Malthus's essay that all species create a surplus of population, and that those who survive are the ones who are best fit to survive in the environment. Spencer argued it's those who are more competitive against others, but it doesn't have to be like that. Wallace, for example, argued that it's from the beginning, and others after him, like Kropotkin, argued that it's not rather competition of individuals, but it's cooperation within groups and mutual aid that leads some group and their individuals and their traits to propagate, etc. So there is a direct link there.
Yeah, I think there is some.
One might take that to question the very theory of evolution. So I know some people who question evolution who take this line, which I don't follow. I mean, Malthus' essay was very ideological. So in my research around Malthus' essays, you would see it was written after an argument he had with his father. His father was a sympathizer of the French Revolution. At the time, there was fear.
I think the internet is breaking up a little. So I think that might be a sort of an indirect signal to all of us to wrap things up here. But I would request all three of you who have entertained us, who have educated us through your remarks, to please share with us one book that you are currently reading right now. And what is that book about?
Yes, sorry, I'm back. Yes,
sorry, the internet
sorry for that. Yes, so I was saying that Malthus was writing explicitly against the call for redistribution, and basically he wanted to show with his strange mathematics and very primitive mathematics, but he had studied mathematics, that if you redistribute, people are going to have more kids, so you're not going to achieve anything. Instead, if you keep people poor, and if you also let people procreate, then the cost of labor is going down, and then you're going to have more growth of food production, and this is going to be better for everyone. I mean, it's a very early and prosaic in a sense argument, but which has been like really elaborated through complex models and remains the dominant ideology to our times. And this is what I argue in my book. It was a very ideological argument, and this is why Malthus had also commercial success, and people of his class loved him, you know, and gave him all the positions and everything, because he was basically justifying the unwillingness of the British elite to redistribute. And also, he was supposedly proving mathematically and logically the impossibility of revolutionary aspirations, and that he was proving, supposedly, that a classless society will never be possible because of this law of population. That means that any classless society is quickly going to collapse into a society of proprietors and dispossessed labor that has to work for the proprietors. In that sense, Malthus' essay was wrong, and in my book I explain what is wrong. Now, the fact that it was ideologically constructed and that Darwin was inspired by that, I wouldn't take it as disproof of the theory of evolution. I mean, I think the theory of evolution has to be confronted in its own terms, and whether the explanations and the empirical facts it has used over time and the edifice it has built is convincing or not. In my view, it is convincing, although the view of nature as a struggle of survival of all against all, even within evolutionary theory, has lost its power. And someone might argue that even Darwin, apart from the initial inspiration from Malthus, was much more open in how he framed his theory of evolution. So good point, yes, that this is another line to follow, but it was not the one that I wanted to emphasize in my book.
Great, great. I'm afraid we have come to the end of proceedings for this session, but before I let you go, I know that Sanjay has to run to his departmental meeting, so I'm going to just go straight to Sanjay and ask him which book is he reading right now. If you could please share that title with us, and then he is free to leave.
Thank you. Well, I'm trying to do remedial reading, have to catch up with Nauman and others. Reading very slowly, as I usually do. Of Abyssinia. I've been trying, as part of a family project, so to speak, to read Samuel Johnson, one of the writers I never read, great 18th century writers. And it's a fascinating book, actually very closely related to the themes that we're discussing today, because it's all about the search for wisdom on the part of a prince and princess who leave a set of idyllic conditions of great prosperity in order to search for wisdom.
So
and
the name of the book is
they have great difficulty finding it. The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, by Samuel Johnson. These days he would be cancelled for cultural appropriation because he's writing about a place he doesn't know, he's never visited. But actually, in quite, I would say, very respectful terms, again, it puts paid to the idea that that all such writing was hierarchical and racist. I don't think that this book is easily described that way.
Thank you, Sanjay, for being very patient and for your great remarks. And Habib University is very thankful. And I will definitely be reaching out to you for your continued help, guidance, and assistance, and your friendship. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Very honored to have been here, and wonderful to see you all and to learn from you, Georgios, as well on your point.
I'm really thankful, Sanjay, for your participation. Learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
If you can probably share one title with us, a book that you're reading right now.
There's an academic and a novel. So the academic book I'm reading is on the things I was talking about, Towards the Society of Degrowth by Onofre Romano, which is an Italian sociologist who's not so well known within our debates, but I think is someone really to look into, because he comes also from the anti-utilitarian and post-development school. He's trying to develop a particular thinking from the Mediterranean of thinking around degrowth, and goes around the idea that Sanjay referred to, the demands of a philosopher that it's potentially problematic, but also very illuminating in certain aspects, Georges Bataille, So he takes idea of bataille of depense and of expenditure of surplus and tries to think the growth from this angle rather than the angle of planetary boundaries that we normally take. And the novel I'm reading, and it's fun, is a friend of mine recommended this author that I didn't know. He's called Terry Pratchett, and he's British, and he has, like, I realized, 20 or 25 books around. He has imagined this fantastic world, that it's a world that it's on the back, the whole universe, the whole world is on the back of a turtle and it's flying in the universe. And then the religious fanatics are arguing that the world is round and it's moving around the universe of planets, you know? And then the people who really believe in truth know the truth, that it's on the back of a turtle, and there is a battle between fanaticism and people questioning this fanaticism, etc., in a very humorous way. So it's a funny book. It's funny, but also illuminating for our world. And I really enjoy reading this novel also, alongside the more academic work.
Last but by no means the least, Dr. Nauman Naqvi.
I've got a dozen books open on my desktop. I usually read on the computer, but I really think we need to close now at this.
Okay, sure. I would like to thank all of you for participating in this great session. We've learned so much. And if people who are watching it, if you have any questions, please be sure to email me with your questions. I'll be sure to pass them on to our eminent speakers tonight. Thank you once again.
Thank you
Very much.
Thank
you very much.
Bye-bye. Very grateful.